Armageddon, World War III. I mean, these are some heavy terms, right? But they aren't just hypotheticals anymore. It's the language being thrown around to describe this escalating conflict between the US, Israel, and Iran. Today, we're going to try to deconstruct the two completely clashing narratives that have brought the world right to the edge.
We're heading to World War III. Wow. That is a direct quote from a senior advisor to the UN. He's essentially accusing the US and Israel of leading what he calls a war of choice. So how on earth did we get to this point, this brink of a potential global catastrophe? To figure that out, we really have to dig into the core arguments coming from both sides.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at how this whole thing is being framed. Is it defense or is it aggression? Then we'll get into the arguments about who the real aggressor is here. After that, we'll explore the totally different endgames that each side is imagining, look at the global economic fallout, which is huge, and finally, try to unpack America's really controversial role in this whole high-stakes showdown.
So let's start at the very beginning of this story. Was this conflict something that just couldn't be avoided, an act of self-defense? Or was it a reckless, deliberate war of choice? Everything, and I mean everything, that follows really hinges on how you answer that one question.
Just look at the language here. It's so extreme. On one hand, you have people calling this a suicide mission. And on the other, it's being framed as this heroic stand, like Churchill and Roosevelt, standing up to evil. This isn't just political spin, you guys. This is a fundamental battle to define reality itself. And it's why these two perspectives seem like they're from different planets.
And that brings us right to the heart of it, the central question. Who started this? Who is the aggressor? Well, as we're about to see, the answer you get depends entirely on which story you believe, because we have two completely opposed worldviews colliding head-on.
Okay, so on one side, the argument is defensive. It paints this picture of a nation that's been under constant threat of being wiped off the map by Iran's radical regime, and at this forced them to act. But the counterargument? It sees this as a calculated power grab, a joint move by the US and Israel to lock down their dominance in the region, even if it means throwing the entire world into chaos.
Now, a really key piece of the pro-intervention argument is this idea of proxy forces. Think groups like Hezbollah or Hamas, groups that are armed and funded by Tehran. From this point of view, an attack by one of these proxies isn't just some random act of violence. No, it's seen as a direct act of war by Iran itself, which in their eyes justifies a massive response.
All right, so if that's the reason for going to war, then what's the end game? What does winning even look like? And here again, we find two totally different ideas for the future of Iran. Is it about liberation, or is it about chaos?
The goal you'll hear stated publicly is often about liberation, freeing the Iranian people, helping them set up a new government. But critics are asking a tough question. Is the real goal something way more cynical? Is it about neutralizing a rival by just plunging it into total, unending chaos? So the story from the pro-intervention side presents this really clear vision. The goal is to dismantle a regime that sponsors terror, end its nuclear threat, and basically unchain the Iranian people so they can finally rise up and take their country back from what they call an evil that threatens the entire world. But critics, they paint a much darker picture. They argue the real goal isn't a stable new Iran at all. It's a shattered, rudderless state, a country so bogged down in its own civil war that it could never, ever again challenge Israeli or US interests in the region. Now, let's step away from the battlefield for a minute, because this conflict is sending massive shockwaves through the global economy. And the reason for that? Well, it can be traced to one of the most important shipping lanes on the entire planet. The Strait of Hormuz, it's the world's #1 oil choke point. You can think of it like the main artery for global energy. And its closure, that's like a major clot in the heart of the world economy. The consequences are immediate, they're severe, and they affect all of us.
So just how serious is this risk? Well, in prediction markets, where people bet real money on what's going to happen, they're actually pricing in the possibility of crude oil hitting $200 a barrel. A price that high wouldn't just cause a recession, it would absolutely shatter the global economy.
And, as this quote says, the world is going to pay a fearsome price. This isn't just about what we pay at the pump. It's about the very real possibility of a huge political backlash against the governments that are seen as being responsible for a global economic meltdown. So finally, we get to the role of the United States. How in the world did a superpower get so tangled up in all this? Well, critics will point to a long and very complicated history of pressure and influence.
There's a theme you hear over and over again from critics, and it's this idea of the Israeli tail wagging the American dog.
It's the argument that for years now, U.S. policy on Iran hasn't really been driven by American interests, but by pressure from Israel.
And this isn't presented as something new. Critics point to this consistent pattern of pressure across different U.S. administrations, from Obama to Trump to today. And it all builds up to a really stunning accusation that the so-called imminent threat that was used to justify this war wasn't a threat from Iran at all, but it was actually the threat of Israel going it alone, basically forcing America's hand.
So, in the end, where does that leave us? We're left with two stories that just cannot both be true. Is this a heroic, Churchill-like stand against evil? Or is it a suicidal mission that's dragging the whole world down with it? The narrative that history ultimately proves right, well, that's not just going to be some footnote. It's going to define the future for every single one of us.